That's me in 1972, a Denton Bronco. It's hard to believe now, but I actually played offensive guard at about 160 pounds. Fortunately, I was surrounded by some of the best players to ever take the field at Broncos Stadium. But even as a team, we weren't very big.
All these guys are athletes. I probably spent more time with the cheerleaders than I did on the field. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but they did give me a uniform. I weighed a smooth 130 pounds. I think I just hit my playing weight that was listed in the program last year. And the only person I ever knocked out was my coach in practice, and that's a completely different story. But I remember the one thing I remember being so small, it hurt. But I would have done anything to hang with his family. Maybe it was Craig that said, this was a family.
The stuff that made us great couldn't be weighed or measured. We had heart, we had character, and we wanted to win for each other.
All of that together just made us something special.
That fall, we were the first Denton High football team to reach the state playoffs in 43 years. Since 1967, the DHS program had been steadily improving. That's when Denton's African American school, Fred Moore, closed its doors and all of Denton's high school students came under one roof. The Fred Moore coach, C.H. Collins, had come over to take charge of the Broncos' defensive line. Collins was already a coaching legend within the all-black Prairie View League and had taken his Fred Moore Dragons to the state championship game 3 times during his tenure at the school. Billy Ryan, an ex-standout quarterback for North Texas State University, had recently risen to the head coaching position at Denton High School, and another former Eagle, All-American guard Bill Quakertown, was in charge of the offensive line. With its newly expanded talent pool and a standout coaching staff, the Broncos were poised to make some football history. Race didn't divide us. If anything, it sat like a chip on our collective shoulder.
I don't think coaches had to go to but we grew up with it. Even when I was a sophomore, it was clear that we had something to prove.
Coach Collins called every player's forearm, regardless of his color, an African soup bone. You were to feed that soup bone to opposing linemen. Coach Quakertown had opened holes for fellow North Texas Eagle Abner Haynes back in the 50s, while Haynes was breaking the color line and rushing records in Texas college football. We were led by a black quarterback, Leslie Varner. Even in 1972, this was a rarity at newly integrated schools in the South. But Les was actually the 3rd African-American quarterback to start for the Broncos in 5 years. In a small but conspicuous way, we were making history. But the history we made and the history that made us can never be entirely separated. So this is our story, but it is also the story of a community that stepped from the shadows of its past into a time when we were all Broncos.
Well, when you start talking about Denton football, you have to go back a few years and you think about your team that you played on and the 1972 team, and you go all the way back to some of their history. There was a team in 1929, Denton High School Broncos, that were undefeated champions that year. I don't know a lot about them, but I do know that they were good.
The 29 Broncos were anchored by players with nicknames like Guts and Bull and Rooster. They had led Denton High School to an undefeated regular season, beating one opponent by a score of 71-0 and holding a total of 6 opponents entirely scoreless. They did it all wearing leather helmets and cardboard shoulder pads. Not even the stock market crash in October slowed them down. They were eventually beaten by Port Arthur, the state co-champs that year, but not before they took their place in Denton football history. It's fun to imagine a matchup between the 29 and 72 Broncos, but in 1929, the two teams could never have met on the same field, at least not in the South. Denton, like all southern towns at the time, was segregated, and Jim Crow laws, written or simply understood, prohibited black and white players from taking the field together. Jokes and sketches like this one, found in the back of the 1929 Broncos yearbook, perpetuated convenient stereotypes. By portraying African Americans as lazy, ignorant, and inarticulate, these caricatures rationalize the relegation of an entire people to second-class citizenship. Denton's own history, which isn't that different from the history of many other southern towns, showed that these attitudes had real consequences. In 1972, few of us that were white thought much about where our black teammates lived or why they lived there. The fact that most of the black players lived in the section of Denton known politely as Southeast Denton or Colored Town, and less politely by other names, was not something that concerned us. If you were white, it wasn't a place you were likely to visit. It is unlikely that any of us, black or white, knew that in 1920, most African American citizens of Denton had lived in a neighborhood known as Quakertown, or that the neighborhood once stood on the site of Civic Center Park, where Denton's Civic Center, city swimming pool, public library, and women's club building now stood. For my generation, the story of Quakertown was a forgotten chapter in Denton's history. That changed in 2008 with the establishment of Denton County's African American Museum. One of only 10 such museums in the state of Texas, the Quakertown Museum is located in one of the few remaining structures from the black neighborhood that once sat along the banks of Pecan Creek near downtown Denton. Curator Kim Cupid now oversees the Quakertown collection, which records the life and ultimate demise of the Quakertown neighborhood.
It wasn't until probably the 1880s and 1890s that residents began building their community in the banks of the Pecan Creek. The first establishment in Quakertown was the St. James AME Church. The residents flocked to Quakertown because of the church. So then other churches were built, and then there were businesses, and eventually it just grew. So by 1900, you had about 63 families that lived in Quakertown. It was a nice central location. A lot of the residents worked at the universities, either the Teachers College, which is now University of North Texas, or the College of Industrial Arts, which is now TWU. So that was an ideal for the residents.
Quakertown coexisted peacefully with the rest of Denton until the president of the Women's College, Frances Marion Brawley, began to perceive the black community as a threat to the growth of his school.
And Quakertown becomes, as President Brawley referred to it, as the menace between his school and downtown Denton, as a menace between his school and the girls walking to and from the train station.
The unsubstantiated fears that Quakertown posed a menace to the young women attending the college dovetailed neatly with a movement to create Denton's first public park.
It became that perhaps the solution would be, well, let's create a park, and why don't we put it where Quakertown is? They would have to buy the property from the different citizens, but they could pay the black citizens a lot less for their property than they would if they were buying property from a white citizen. So in April of 1921, a bond election was held to set aside $75,000 for the creation of the city park. And it was voted on and passed.
The dislocation of Quakertown's residents was ultimately accomplished within the bounds of the law. But attempts by black citizens to fight back within those same boundaries could prove futile.
My grandfather decided he would file a suit against it. I don't know who told him about it, but he decided he'd go up and file a suit. Well, he filed a suit, but then he was advised, and because I had one sister my oldest sister was born in Quakertown. He was warned that if he expected that little girl to do well, in other words, to live, it would be best for him to drop that suit. So he dropped the suit.
The residents of Quakertown were forced to relocate to an unimproved cow pasture on the southeast side of town that would become known as Solomon Hill.
While Quakertown had electricity, Quakertown had sidewalks, it had roads, it had streets, Solomon Hill had none of this. Solomon Hill was also downwind of the sewer system.
The destruction of Quakertown and the loss of its businesses, services, and convenient proximity to employment was a devastating blow to Denton's African American community. Though it became a buried memory in the consciousness of Denton's white community, the shadow it cast on African Americans lingered.
My husband, he was a resident of Quakertown. He was a young man when they had to move out. He was about 21 years old. And when we'd have to go to City Hall to pay our utilities bill, then he would tell me the stories over and over again. When the Civic Center building was built, then he would tell me the story. When the swimming pool was built, he would tell me the story. And when the children would want to go swimming, he would drive us there and leave us and come back because he said the memories was too bitter for him to accept.
Denton's African American community reestablished itself around its churches and school. Segregation and Jim Crow kept them a community apart from their white neighbors. But there was at least one point of contact that seemed to defy attempts to keep blacks and whites separate.
We had more white people at our football games than we did black. They were just full of white people because they all knew the Black Dragons, the Fred Douglass Dragons.
We'd ride our horses. See, there's no bleachers on the east side. There's a hedge there, and we'd ride our horses across the aviation field, tie them up the fence, and there was holes in that cyclone fence, and you'd crawl under and sneak in. Then all the blacks in Denton came and supported them and had the zoot suits on. They'd be playing that boogie music. And one of the great players here was Boxhead Sims, little Ernest Sims. He was one of these little 5'8", like a bowling ball, and he had gone to Prairie View. So he had graduated high school and gone to Prairie View to play football, and it was homecoming. And he came up visiting, and Fred Moore was behind at the half. They suited up, right? And he played for 2 plays. And the ball was on Fred Moore's 1-yard line, and Ernest got the ball 4 yards behind the line. He ran all the way for a touchdown, 104 yards. And then when he got the ball back again, he ran for another touchdown. I don't know if they won or not, but...
The common ground of football, though seemingly trivial, kept black citizens connected to the rest of Denton. What role Denton's affection for football may have played in the white school board's decision to build a new school in southeast Denton is open to question. What is not open to question is the role played by a man named Fred Moore. Born in 1875 to an illiterate woman who was herself the daughter of slaves, abandoned by his biological father, who was said to be a Native American, and ultimately raised by a cowboy who had once run with the Sam Bass Gang, Fred Douglass Moore's pedigree seemed unlikely for a man who would become a lifelong educator. Moore worked as a barber and musician until he was almost 40 years old. At that time, he earned his teaching certificate through a process of self-study and received a teaching position at the Fred Douglass School. Shortly thereafter, Moore rose to the position of principal of the school after its reconstruction outside of Quakertown in 1915. Moore, at various times, continued his education at Prairie View College in Texas, Fisk University in Nashville, and Columbia University in New York. Into his 70s, Moore labored as an educator, school administrator, and community leader among the people of southeast Denton. During his tenure as principal, he expanded the grades taught at Fred Moore from 11 to 12, qualifying his students for entry into the system of African American colleges that served the state's black population.
We had teachers, lawyers, doctors to come out of there with hand-me-down books, tore up books, but we made it.
He instituted cooperative programs with Denton's colleges, including a band program with North Texas State, and he saw that generations of Fred Douglass students absorbed the axioms he lived by, which stressed kindness and self-respect. As a community leader, he oversaw the creation of a park that Denton's African Americans could call their own and helped acquire land for an African American cemetery. By the late 1940s, Moore's long-held dream of building a new school to replace the dilapidated structure that had stood since 1915 had become a reality. In 1949, in a letter commemorating the opening of the newly erected Fred Douglass School, Superintendent of Denton Schools, Chester O. Strickland, wrote, "The colored people of Denton are to be congratulated upon their splendid spirit shown in building one of the finest schools for their people in the state. Professor Fred D. Moore has done much to build a wholesome spirit between the two races in Denton. He has furnished a high-class leadership in the field of education as well as the entire community. He has the respect of his white friends and the admiration of the community." Strickland's letter suggests yet another contribution Moore made during his decades of service to Denton's African Americans. Though his vision of the future bore more connection to the patient policies of Booker T. Washington than the world-shaking dream of Martin Luther King, Moore had built small but significant bridges between Denton's black and white communities. Fred Moore died in 1952, at the dawn of an era of change. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education began to undermine the system he had lived under for nearly 3/4 of a century. It would take a decade for the decision to begin taking effect in most southern cities and towns, but change in Denton would come sooner than later. In 1955, an African American student sued successfully for admission to Denton's North Texas State College. The suit was not appealed, and in 1956, amid an atmosphere of violent confrontation elsewhere in the nation, African Americans were quietly admitted along with the rest of the freshman class. One of these black students, a young man named Abner Haynes, was about to become a trailblazer for black student athletes throughout the South. A decade before the renowned Southwest Conference admitted its first black football player, Haynes and teammate Leon King would be the first African Americans to wear a North Texas Eagle uniform. During his 4 years at North Texas as a running back, Haynes, a Denton native, would lead the Eagles to 3 winning seasons and a berth at the 1959 Sun Bowl, putting the school's football program on the national map. Though admitted without fanfare or headlines, along with other black students, his feats on the football field dominated the sports pages of the Denton Record Chronicle as he broke records and earned All-American honors at his hometown college. Leaving North Texas for the pros in 1960, Abner Haynes became the American Football League's Rookie of the Year and Most Valuable Player. In 1961, he spearheaded the Dallas Texans' drive to become AFL champions, and he continued to be a professional standout for 8 seasons, during which he played for the Kansas City Chiefs, the Denver Broncos, the Miami Dolphins, and the New York Jets. In Haynes, for the first time, all of Denton's people had a superstar they could call their own. Bill Carrico, Abner Haynes' fellow Eagle and friend of nearly 60 years, understood that Haynes' contributions went beyond his athletic skills and that the sacrifices he made to represent the Eagles came both on and off the field.
Some of the color line had been broken, but it was a long fight. We went to Des Moines, Iowa, and we were eating breakfast. We ate breakfast, and we were walking out away from our hotel. And Abner and Leon King came with him. But they were walking in the opposite direction. We said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm going over to the hotel." "What are you coming from there for?" He said, "Well, I had to stay in a different hotel." And he could eat breakfast in that hotel, but if he ate breakfast in the hotel with us, he had to eat in the kitchen. And what we said to Abner was, "Abner, this is not right." He said, "It's not right, but it's the way it is. So you accept it." And I accept it. And we go on and play.
The team members from that era have remained close friends, and they still meet every year to celebrate their trip to the Sun Bowl and revisit the challenges and triumphs of their seasons together. Abner, no longer the sleek halfback that slashed through opposing defenses, now takes an unquestioned seat at the head of the table. 6 decades ago, that place, even among his Eagle teammates, was less than certain.
Yeah, we go in the locker rooms, they'll sign the stuff, and this was really fun. one of the players said, I don't want to be locking next to you. Can I lock her somewhere else? And everybody said, yeah. And Bernard Cole said, I'll lock her next to him. And John Darby from Pampa, Texas said, I'll lock her next to him. And we went up. And the guy that didn't want to sit next to me, I saw him today. That's the way life is, man.
Abner's talent and demeanor soon overcame any skepticism about his place on the team. If anything, the discrimination the Eagles encountered from the all-white teams they opposed stoked their desire to win.
One time we were playing Arden Simmons and called him a ugly name. I told the guy in front of me, I said, who said that? He said, I don't know. I said, well, you tell him don't play it anymore. I came back, I said, you tell him? He said, yeah, but I can't stop him. And I said, well, no, I can't say what I said. But I said, when I hit you, and you hurt so bad that you go tell that guy to quit. I hit him. Next play said it again. I hit him again. Next play said he gonna say it anymore.
That's kind of the way Carrico always was. And when he came in, he was already the way it was like he already knew. We ain't gonna, and the players were not gonna be gamed by no system that were gonna make us lose.
Though Haynes had won over his teammates, it was not until the Eagles played an away game at the University of Houston that he came to understand the extent to which he and the Eagle team had changed the culture of a whole college.
They told us in practice, there's no hotel that's gonna accept us. We are gonna have to sleep on the train. And so practice went on, and then that Friday for the game, or maybe that Thursday, Billy, I don't remember exactly. But I remember him announcing to us that we might not get much sleep, but the student body was so upset about us not finding a hotel. 5,000 of them had decided to ride down on the train with us. That's when I started falling in love with North Texas. What the teachers and the coaches, the students were so pissed off at what was happening to their team. And that's what we've forgotten and quit doing. And they became activists.
Abner Haynes is remembered by many for the place he holds in football history, but some remember him for the much more personal contribution he made to their lives.
He has a strong family tie in Denton. His father was a minister in Denton, so we knew, as we used to call him, Butch, and he graduated from Lincoln High School. We still claim that's from Denton. That's one of the reasons I wanted to go to North Texas, because of Butch.
He kind of broke the barrier for Denton, and then also on the southeast side of Denton, that people like myself knew because he went that I might have a chance to go. And he used to come back and tell us stories about what he had to go through, and especially on the road, because some of the colleges still didn't have blacks, you know. And so he went through a lot, and he shared a lot of things with us, and he instilled in us that it doesn't matter what color you are. Get out there, play as hard as you can, give it your all, and you can succeed. And he lived that.
Despite Haynes' status as a local hero, the reality was that beyond the walls of the universities, Denton was still a segregated town.
My brother just got out of service, and so we went there to get a hamburger. The girl came up to the window, took our order, and we were just sitting there talking. She came back and said, "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you." Woo! You talking about? I couldn't do nothing, but I was hot as fire.
We could go to the Dreamland Theater, but we had to go around to the back door, and we had to sit up in the balcony. The white people sat out there and went in the front door, and we went around to the back and went up. We had to sit upstairs for that. to see that. And then we had to play only in our park down here on Lakey Street. We couldn't go to the white parks. And we had to go to this school right here, Fred Douglass. It was Fred Douglass then, it's Fred Moore now.
I never knew nobody's name, a white person, period, till I was in the 9th grade. Never. I knew that my mom used to clean houses for them, and they little kids was wanting to play with us. We'd be in the car, my mom be cleaning the house, and the kids wanted to play with us, a little white guy. We wanted to play with them, but we weren't allowed to play with each other. We'd have to sit in the hot car till my mom get through cleaning up, and then we'd leave. But they wanted to play and we wanted to play, but we wasn't allowed to.
I can remember when we'd had rain after rain after rain, and it was very difficult for you to do your laundry and hang your clothes out and get them dry. And some of us had finally, in frustration, just gone to a local laundromat. At that time, it was just, most of these things were understood that you were not wanted there, and so you didn't go. They didn't have signs on everything. And I think about the third time I showed up at that laundromat, they had put signs at the door that said whites only. We laughed about the possibility of only taking our white clothes in and leaving the coloreds at the door, but we didn't actually do that, of course.
Oh, you should have.
The dormitories did not welcome the black students that came from different parts of Texas. So they stayed in homes of many of the people here. And my brother's families kept some of them in all walks, from education to music to everything. So there's a lot of professors and all out there that have stayed in the Mohair homes and other homes too. That's cool.
To some, the contradictions were becoming too apparent to ignore. College students, black and white, had begun peacefully protesting for the right to eat together at Denton's restaurants, sit side by side in the same movie theater, and shop where they liked.
My father was a political science professor at North Texas and was very well known. As a matter of fact, he took his class, his government class, and brought them to the campus theater, and they were mixed racially, and he integrated the campus theater because he just thought it was the right thing to do.
The hometown newspaper was struggling to represent a constantly changing consensus.
We had a meeting when the integration movement began, and we discussed it at great length, and we all agreed with the news department, the editors, etc., that we would not make a big issue of race.
It's always hard to look back at coverage and decide, whether that was adequate, or because you don't know what would have happened if the coverage had been more, if there'd been more coverage at that time. It's all has to be a guess because one's reality and the other one is speculation. I think that certainly the minority in Denton, the blacks, would have appreciated knowing when their fellow students from the University of North Texas began standing in at the campus theater.
The murkiness of civil rights legislation in the early 60s led to corrosive indecision in many communities. Dallas, just down the road, was beginning a process of half measures that would embroil it in the federal courts for the next 40 years and create intractable problems for its school system. However, through the power of their elected officials, the people of Denton would choose another path that would have far-reaching implications for their town. A year before the ratification of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Denton's school board, under no threat of legal action, voted to desegregate Denton schools immediately. In a later interview, then president of the school board, Raymond Wheeler, recalled, "I had school board presidents calling me from all over the state that same night. It made the Associated Press and television. And they'd say, 'We know that what y'all did is the right thing to do, but we just don't have the courage to do it.' It wasn't because we were heroes. It was just a case of some prudent men who finally got together and said that was the thing to do." David Whitten, son of one of the other members of the school board, Royce Whitten, recalls his father's thinking at the time.
I know he was acutely aware of how ugly things had been, especially in the Deep South. Phil and I were talking about that, in Alabama and Mississippi, and you know, what had happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. Very, very ugly situations. And I know he and other members of the school board, Mr. Wheeler, Mr. Harpool, and others, they didn't want to see that happen here.
The school board's action was a precedent in the state of Texas, and it set Denton apart as a town ready to meet the challenges of a changing world. Denton city government supported the school board the following week by declaring all of the city's public facilities open to all citizens, regardless of race or color. Mayor Warren Whitson formed a committee of both black and white citizens to facilitate the changes. Denton had moved decisively into a new era. Though one could not happen without the other, desegregation and integration were not the same thing. The Fred Moore School would stay open for 5 more years. While most black students would choose to remain at Fred Moore, a few would make the transition to the white schools. The relationships they formed during those early years were the first to break the color line in Denton's public schools.
And I think that's where the difference came in, is when we started attending school with people of different races. Then you actually got to know that person, and you probably had more in common than you had different. I know y'all talk a lot about football, but I was in band, and I was in band from the 5th grade on, so I got to know those people really, really well.
These relationships were not without pitfalls, even for those too young to understand what a color line was.
I had been invited to spend the night with one of my friends, and she was a white girl, and we had the best time. We had gone outside and played, and it was that evening, and we were all sitting around at the dinner table. She had an older sister and a younger brother and a mom, of course, and I thought everything was going really, really well until her father, just out of the blue, said, "Melinda, I hear you're friends with a little," and he used the N-word, girl. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked and horrified. I mean, I'm in the 4th grade, I'm a kid. Mm-hmm. But an adult says that to me. And I'm just like, I didn't know how to respond, but I knew that I had to tell the truth, and I knew I had to be polite because I was at somebody else's home. So I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he proceeded to tell me that if I continued to be friends with that little girl, and he used the N-word again, that I was not welcome back in his home.
With access to Denton's parks and other public places, boys often found it easier to bond within the common culture of sports and other group activities.
At a very early age, I was in the Boy Scouts. We had a young white gentleman that would come over to Fred Moore and help out with the Boy Scouts because, he was there to show us what we needed to do. He would take us out to different things that were taking place in the neighborhood, which you had to leave the African American neighborhood to be able to see this stuff.
If you're willing to participate in Denton, you can. And that's been a beautiful thing. Now, I have to admit that that's something that always happened. Going back to my Pee Wee baseball, Little League baseball, Mr. Matthews, I was going through Denton Civic Center Park, what it was called then. And Mr. Matthews said, "Hey, you like baseball?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You want to play?" I said, "I don't have a glove." He said, "Yes, you do." He tossed me a glove, and I came back home and told mother the man wanted me to play baseball. She said, "You don't have a glove." I said, "Well, he said I do."
Sports, if only during summer vacation from school, were working their magic. But the most effective display of teamwork in this transitional period was shown not by boys on a baseball diamond, but by a group of women meeting once a month in each other's homes.
I think what had happened in Denton, in terms of activists, really was a group of women, and that was the Women's Interracial Fellowship, which was a group that just formed because there were these women who wanted to help.
I don't think any of us thought of it as creating a social movement. We were interested in getting to be friends because we were finding a whole new group of people with very different backgrounds and different situations in our home. And we were just interested in how each faced their own problems.
All of us that had children in school, all the black women, they invited us, and we would go from home to home, different homes, and meet. It was once a month.
Yeah. Yes.
And we just got to know each other, and we just had a good time together.
We've been friends ever since.
Yes.
You know, I was really ready for this. And when I made friends with Miss Evelyn Ebron here in town, oh my goodness, I idolized her. She told me that she couldn't go downtown to the square to shop, but she could go in the back door after hours and spend her money there. But she couldn't go in the front door and shop during the regular time. That just made me furious. So that's why I kept on being active in this organization.
Initially formed to create opportunities for engagement and to prepare their children for integration, the women's group quickly discovered that they could have an impact that reached beyond their own circle.
When we sent this paid our bills to a business, we put these little stamps on there and said, we appreciate if you recognize the fact that people of all colors and races deserve equal treatment. We also had, we're very aware, especially when the schools started being integrated and the busing situation, that was all because of the housing situation. And that we could never really overcome that busing all the way as long as the housing was segregated situation. So we also took around a pledge card to get our neighbors to sign that we would welcome having the renters rent to people or sell to people with no regard to race.
They would assign 2 or 3 to go to different places, and Ella Jones and I went to the Holiday Inn, scared to death, but we made it. And they treated us real nice, but that was breaking it down to segregation, and it worked.
As the Women's Interracial Fellowship evolved from a social group into a team of activists, one of their members stepped forward to take them to the next level. Trudy Foster had lived overseas for a number of years in a culture where she had endured discrimination for both her gender and her religion. Upon moving to Denton, she witnessed situations that were all too familiar and which compelled her to take action.
The activity part of this really started with Trudy. We were working more with making friends, getting our families acquainted, and when Trudy stepped in, she saw that it needed to be more than that. We needed, and I would have never thought of going in front of the city council and raising a fuss with them. But she did. She was ready for it.
I mean, every time that the city council would meet, Trudy would be there, and she constantly influenced the mayor and the city council that time that it wasn't necessary.
And we walked the streets in the mud, in the rain, because we didn't have paved streets. Trudy's the one that started getting our streets paved, getting the signatures.
She just didn't know what no meant. When there was something she wanted to get done, if she said, well, you can't do that, she would say, then how do we do this?
At a time when the limits of equality for both women and minorities were being tested, the members of the Women's Interracial Fellowship were showing quiet courage on 2 fronts. While their efforts in Southeast Denton bore tangible results, the most lasting legacy of the group may lie in the friendships they forged and the example they set for others.
Dragons, the mighty, mighty dragons. Yada, 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 yada. Yada, 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 yada. Hey, hey, hey. And it was on.
New teams had formed, but old teams would be coming to the end of their season. In the late 60s, the final step in the desegregation of Denton's public schools would come with the closing of Fred Moore. But it was a bittersweet moment for the people it had served for over half a century.
It's not a person is our age and older, it's been away for years, the first place they want to come is Fred Moore still there? That's the first thing you're gonna say. I just want to go by and see it.
I'll never forget, me and Johnny B was Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Talent shows?
We were Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Talent shows.
Talent shows.
Oh, the talent shows.
Musicals.
Musicals, plays.
Graduations. Yeah, we had talent shows. Some people were James Brown. We had Aretha Franklin here.
Right.
Temptation was here before.
Those people came?
No. They thought they were. But they could act just like them. They dressed like them.
That's right.
Marvin Gaye and everybody. We even had one group, black group. They was the Beatles. Rudolph and Randolph. The Beatles. They imitated them.
Had the Beatles
and had the Beatles wigs and the guitar. When they was there.
Miss Brooks and the choir always had something that they could perform.
Tell me about her.
Oh, I would say Miss Proper.
Miss Proper.
Yeah, that was the lady.
That was the lady.
We would have to sit and our backs could not touch the chair.
Nope.
You had
No
to
talking.
Sit properly, and then she's even on you when you eat.
You got to hold your fork right.
She
Napkin in the lap.
Miss Barrow, fifth grade teacher, Miss Barrow didn't like left-handed kids, period. I went to the board, and she sent me to the board, and I get to the board, and all of a sudden this eraser come flying by. And next thing I knew, she said, "Get that chalk out of that hand." I said, "I'm left-handed." She says, "Not in my classroom." And from that point on, I had to pay close attention to whatever Miss Barrow said, and make sure that I did whatever Miss Barrow wanted me to do. And she kind of helped me get my path lined out a little bit better than it had been, because I didn't want to see another eraser coming by my head.
Miss Alice Alexander, she was my first grade teacher. One of the reasons she inspired me because she gave back so much to the community, and I just feel like she carried on her father's legacy as far as racial equality and harmony in the community.
Miss Alice Alexander, that was Prof. Moore's daughter. And she was the elementary teacher. Well, she taught all of us. You people our age, she taught us all. And it was just closeness, family. And that's what was hard when they had to go to the other school, because they didn't have that closeness.
The 72 Broncos were in 8th grade when Fred Moore closed its junior high and elementary school. The high schools had been consolidated the year before, and for the most part, white students remember it as a non-event.
I was raised in a very white neighborhood and went to a very white elementary school, and it wasn't until 7th grade when we were all put together at Denton Junior High that all of a sudden I realized there are all these other people that are, that go to school with me and dress the same or dress differently, and they may act the same or act differently, and they have completely different ways of thinking.
Before Fred Moore closed, we talked about it at home, and I thought it was so sad. I couldn't imagine that their school was being closed, because I loved my school, and it would have been so upsetting to me, and I felt sorry for those kids. And I felt sorry. I thought they should have a choice, that they shouldn't be forced to come, but it was great with me for them to come.
The African American students, however, did confront some new challenges.
I had finished number 1 in a class of 48, and then when I got to Strickland, and then my schedule had placed me in related basic classes. And it was Mr. Reed Jackson, my math teacher, that questioned, "What are you doing in this class? You don't need to be in this class." And I said, "Well, that's my schedule." And he said, "Oh, we need to go and check this out." And that's where they had placed me in most of my classes. And then come to find out that the same thing had happened to my brother Calvin before that. And he was even placed lower than I was. They actually placed him in the special ed class, and this made us feel really uncomfortable, coming from where someone had us, you're going to be this person, you're going to be responsible, you're going to, challenges are there for you, and the expectations were just high, and then to come into the situation where You're just somebody that's, you
Was
might
that-
make it and you may not.
There would be rough patches, but a corner had been turned. Now, at least, we had an opportunity to get to know each other.
They were sort of standoffish to their group, and we were sort of standoffish to ours, and so there really wasn't much mixing until I got on the basketball team. And I became really closely acquainted with Maurice Evans, who is one of the top-notch people I've ever known.
Beyond the walls of the schools, there was one very conspicuous change that all of Denton seemed to notice, and it coincided with the closing of Fred Moore. Bronco football was getting better. The team had gone from a single win in the combined 65 and 66 seasons to a respectable 6-3-1 in 1967 and an impressive 7-3 the following year. And they'd done it behind an incredibly gifted black quarterback named Don Woods. Integrate and go to state suddenly seemed like more than a catchy slogan.
Don Woods came along, who's probably one of the most fantastic athletes to come out of Texas. He's definitely one of the greatest to ever come out of Denton. Don's just a special talent that you don't coach many of them in a coaching career.
Woods wasn't simply talented. He also knew what it meant to lead a team to a winning season. In his last year at Fred Moore, the sophomore quarterback took his team all the way to the Prairie View League state championship.
We would beat up on a lot of teams, Wichita Falls, Quakertown, It was just that we was pretty much the bedrock of these southern black schools. But once we came to Denton High, it was totally different. It was totally different, and pretty much everything was up and down because it was pretty much equal at the time, the teams that we played. So it was going from a powerhouse, coming to a team that we pretty much struggling because we were trying to find our little niche. So that was the comparison. Powerhouse coming to a team where they were rebuilding,
Wood's talent and leadership abilities quickly endeared him to his teammates. But some of Denton's traditional rivals, like Garland, were less welcoming. Woods, however, always had an answer.
Before the kickoff, the whole stands in unison, I don't know if they had it planned or not, stood up and said, "Kick the ball to Leroy, kick the ball to Leroy," over and over. And they did, after being warned not to by the other coaches in the district. And he got about to the 30-yard line and somebody hit his right thigh and he bounced off like a rubber ball. And he went another 10 yards and somebody else hit him. And the next thing he did was he put the ball down in the end zone. And the rest of the night, we never heard him kick the ball to Leroy again.
Despite the occasional challenge, Woods clearly found a way to thrive at Denton High School, and not just on the football field. In 1968, he was named Mr. DHS.
It was a surprise, but it was a great honor being the first African American be named Mr. DHS, and I don't know if there's been any since, but that was a good honor for me, man. Just being able to being elected, by your peers, black and white students,
Woods believes that those early years after desegregation were about more than good football.
We was going into a new direction. We was going into a new direction of different cultures, different mindsets of people once we totally integrated. So it was sort of like a melting pot. We came together and we saw some of the guys, football players that I played with, they didn't see color at that time. They didn't see color, so it was just one common goal, come over to be the best football players we could be and try to be the best football team that we could be, I'm pretty sure, people saw it, that was older than me, but it was sort of, like I said, it was sort of going into a new direction at that time, which was very good for Denton as well, not only for Denton High, but just mainly for the community,
After Don Wood's departure, the quarterback position was filled in 1969 by another African American, James McDonald. Though Woods faced the occasional taunt from opposing fans, McDonald had overcome some very different challenges on his way to becoming a Broncos starter.
I was born club-footed, you know. I heard I was born with both my feet like that, you know, and growing up, I don't remember anything about growing up, but going back and forth to the doctor, going, getting cast on, going back, get a cast off, getting the cast put back on, come home, going back to Fort Worth. I don't remember riding no tricycles. I don't remember doing nothing like that, none whatsoever. And man, you're talking about name calling when I was growing up. Man, you know, Crooked Foot, just guys on the south part of town, you know, Crooked Foot and everything. But right around when it got around football season, when it got time where I could outrun some of those people that was doing all the talking, all of that went away.
Crooked Foot aside, McDonald's talents did not go unnoticed by his high school teammates.
Lewis Whitson, who was the coach my junior year, came to me and said, "Johnny, we're going to make you a quarterback." I said, "Coach, I can't throw." I said, "I can throw a baseball, but I can't throw a football. I can't make it spiral. I don't have that strong arm." And he says, "Well, we need a quarterback, and we're going to make you the quarterback." And I went home and came back the next day and said, "Coach, I got a great idea." I said, "I know who's going to be our quarterback. How about James McDonald?"
Coach McDaniels came up to me and said that the team had voted you to play quarterback, you know, and I was saying, I didn't know anything about a vote. I didn't know anything about it at all, you know.
So the next thing I know, James McDonald has been moved to quarterback. So I don't know if James even knows that story.
Bronco coaches were looking forward to watching McDonald and his promising sophomore team mature in the coming years. But fate had one more hurdle for McDonald to overcome before he could complete his career as a Bronco.
Well, it was on March 14, 1968. I got run over by a 18-wheeler and I waited on the ambulance, and they were taking me to the hospital, and so I asked them to speed up because they were driving too slow. So, and then they took me to the hospital and stayed in the hospital like about 4 months, you know, sleeping on my back, you know.
It looked like McDonald's football career might be over, but James was still destined to make some DHS history.
James McDonald, who had overcome a massive injury the year before, that was so massive we were afraid to play him. But he stepped in the second or third ball game of the year in 1969, and all of a sudden we clicked and we went on one of the rest of our ball games. It was the first time since 1929 that Denton had been a part of a championship.
Woods and McDonald's 3 back-to-back years as Bronco quarterbacks would go unnoticed today. But in the late 60s, a black quarterback on a majority white high school team in the South was almost unheard of.
I never played against a black quarterback when I was playing. You didn't hardly even see any colleges having black quarterbacks at that time. You know, looking at TV and stuff, you know, you didn't really see no black quarterbacks at all, you know.
Among Denton's traditional district rivals, mostly all-white suburbs of Dallas, the integrated Broncos sometimes amounted to an affront.
We played Highland Park. we took the bus in, and coach, I don't know, he was talking to us about something, but anyway, everybody's kind of slow getting off the bus. Well, there's some kids outside the bus, and of course, as the players unloaded, somebody said there's 1, and there's 2, and there's 3, and there's 4. We heard the counting, but we didn't register what they were counting until the last person got off, and they said it's 8. Well, that's how many African Americans we had on the team.
But if the Broncos symbolized something negative to their opponents, they were beginning to stand for something quite the opposite to many of their fans.
We had so many outstanding athletes, black athletes, white athletes, and to see their example as a team, you know, pulling together, pulling for one another, I think that said something to me without me even realizing it.
And it really was exciting to be able to all, as a community, share that Bronco pride.
Well, when you went to a Denton High School game, you didn't see color,
you saw boys of different race teaming together and making that football look so pretty. I thought that was simply beautiful for Denton, a segregated little town, to unite and just flow together. Oh, I know that there were ups and downs. I know there were bumps, but just looking from the outside, looking at that team, those boys played together.
Denton had come a long way from the days when a racist joke could be slipped into the back of the 1929 Bronco yearbook. But progress had been made only because someone always stepped up. Whether it was a soft-spoken principal, a young college student who had bucked the traditions of Texas college football, or a group of determined women, Denton, it seemed, could always produce the right people at the right time. The successful integration of Bronco football was no different. While the Denton Broncos had been struggling in the years prior to the closing of Fred Moore High School, Coach C.H. Collins had led the Fred Moore Dragons to 3 state championship games in the African American Prairie View League during his 13-year tenure.
Myself and another guy, his name is Don Burnett, we were the only 2 kids that was allowed to get on that bus and go out to the games, as a cowboy. So from a cowboy, I learned, discipline, I learned respect, and, he's just a great man. I wanted to play for Coach Collins. I went to all the games out of town, just me and the other guy, Don Burnett, and I enjoyed being around him. And it really bothered me when, that I had to leave Fred Moore and then had to go to Strickland Junior High School. I always wanted Coach Collins, wanted to be up under his wing at all times.
Like so many coaches at African American schools, he had served as disciplinarian, surrogate parent, and guidance counselor to students disadvantaged by segregation and its side effects.
Coach loved everybody. He showed that love and shared that love with everybody. It goes back to his going to East Texas, bring back watermelons for, we used to say for the football players, but anybody that came up, you wanted watermelon, you got it, and Coach never cared. But that's how he was. He was caring, he was giving, but also he was very firm.
Coach had a green van truck, and he used to ride. He knew it was a party, he'd ride by the party, everybody see that green truck coming, they would scatter. And he always had one guy that would tell, he'd whoop him and say, who was in there? Don, Jimmy, Carl, he would tell everybody.
Dad was a disciplinarian. He loved children. He gave everyone a fair, impartial opportunity. He would do anything for those students. I can remember at Fred Moore, I can remember if I made the mistake and forgot to get my lunch money from my mother, I knew I was in trouble, because I knew if Dad had any money, that if I didn't get there before those boys did, or any student, that I wouldn't have no lunch because I wouldn't have any money because Dad wouldn't have a dime because those students were going to get it all, That used to really, really upset me. I thought, well, I'm his child. At least he could have some money for me. But I understood he was just very generous, but he demanded respect.
Though he received an offer to become an assistant coach at Denton High School, Collins might well have seen the closing of Fred Moore as the end of his coaching career in Denton. There were plenty of schools in other towns or even other states who needed head coaches with his skills.
My mother at that particular time had been thinking about us moving to a city. And I think she thought maybe when the decision had been made that we were going to integrate, that we would do that. But I knew we weren't going to do that because Daddy was not going to leave his boys. He was going to make sure that he was with those boys to make that transition. The man had worked too hard. He had come here, helped put Denton on the map. Of course, we know about North Texas State University and Texas Women's University, but people knew about Fred Moore Dragons too.
At first, he didn't want to come to Denton because he didn't want to lose his head coaching position and go to be an assistant. But he finally agreed on it because if he didn't come, the kids weren't coming. And they did. And it was probably the main reason that integration went so smooth.
So Collins came to Denton High School and adopted the Broncos purple and gold as his new school colors.
The first day that we worked out, if y'all remember, one of the kids raised up his fist and hollered "Black Power." Well, there was coaches and parents, and players. When Coach said what he said, nobody moved. And he put some adjectives in it that we can't use on television. But he said there was no black power, no white power, just purple.
Black coaches at newly integrated schools in Texas were as rare as black quarterbacks. But Collins was welcomed by a group of men who shared his belief in purple power.
A lot of friendships were formed the very first day when Coach Collins came over. And I think the attitude and the respect that we had for him as a man, Coach Collins was a legend in Texas already. And if you played Fred Moore, you better be ready to play.
Opponents would soon discover that a Bronco with the heart of a dragon was a force to be reckoned with. And if there was any question about whether this coaching staff would cohere as a team, it was quickly put to rest by the remarkable management skills of head coach Billy Ryan.
I used to see how Coach Ryan respected Coach Bean. I never saw Coach Ryan call plays. I saw Coach Hutchins would call the plays, and Coach Ryan would just stand back and let them do their thing. And he respected that, and I think that trickled down to the players also.
In his quiet way, Billy Ryan was a brilliant coordinator. He placed respect for others at the top of the list of attributes he looked for in both his players and his coaches.
He was a good player, and he knew the ball, he knew football, but he knew people better. He placed them. He let his assistants work.
Working with Billy Ryan was, Billy let us coach. And he had the right attitude every time.
Treated us just like we were equals, and that made a lot of difference in the way we coached.
All of the coaches, they were a close-knit team and they were a family. And they all were invested in their job and invested in each other as a group. And it was more like family.
By the time my team, the 72 Broncos, reached our senior year, desegregation had given way in some areas to what might truly be called integration. School favorites, basketball sweethearts, homecoming queens, and even Mr. DHS were often African American. Denton High seemed to be embracing diversity at home, but white flight had hit the cities to our south, and our district opponents still reflected a divide that Denton had already found a way to bridge. Though it had everything to do with talent and nothing to do with sending a message, the Broncos were starting their third black quarterback in 5 years. Les Varner and his cousin Joe Varner, a rushing prodigy, had led the previous year's team as juniors to a district co-championship. Though Denton had once again been locked out of the playoffs, Les and Joe provided a sample of things to come. Les had emerged as a team leader with a strong arm and the ability to run the keeper. Joe had rushed for over 1,200 yards and had shown himself to be one of the best high school tailbacks in the state, if not the nation.
Joe, guess what? He didn't really take it serious. It was fun day. It was fun. And Les would get on and say, "All right, Joe, you say you ain't giving it you 100% and stuff. Just I'm tired and stuff." He said, "I'll tell you what, I'll get this ball to you. You better do something with it." So that's what Les would right. Les rode Joe harder than anybody.
Joe and Les couldn't have been more different. Joe was cool, quiet, and effortless. Les was a tireless motivator who never stopped thinking about the game. Different as the Varners were from each other, they were a team within a team.
And Joe, he had God-gifted talent. He didn't like to practice, but he would get in the game, and you would think he was the best practice player there was. But that's just how talented he was. My memories of joining a game is he would get tired fast. He'd break one for 40, 50 yards. He might not score. We get in the huddle. We in the huddle, I'm gonna call the play. He look at me and say, don't run me. I said, what? He said, I'm tired, don't run me. So then I said, okay, 8 sweet. That was me. And I'd break one for 20 or 30, and he'd come back, he said, okay, I'm ready.
You were just relief calling.
Oh, just relief calling. But he would get mad when I would break one. And he'd get his rest, and he said, okay, I'm ready. And he was ready to shine.
The South Garland game, when he was hurt, laid down, Les, you remember that? Mm-hmm. And we went out to check on him. Carrico and I and the trainer maybe was out there, and we said, what's wrong? He said, I'm fine, how's the crowd taking it? We said, get back in that up. Leslie was over there.
Strong as we looked going into the season, the teams we were facing looked just as strong.
Denton was in with Garland, South Garland, Mesquite, North Mesquite, Highland Park, and R.L. Turner Carrollton when they just had one high school. And that district was powerful. I think one of the Dallas newspapers said that 8-4A, any team could be in the top 10.
The non-district games at the beginning of the season were meant to build our confidence, but they raised more questions than they answered.
So after the first 3 games of this season, we're kind of scratching our heads. You know, we got 1 tie, 1 win, 1 loss. We needed to mature in a hurry because the next 3 weeks we faced 3 top 10 teams. And the first one we came up against was Sam Houston Texans. They were 10th ranked, undefeated. They were heavily favored with us.
We put our uncertain start behind us with a 32-7 rout of 10th ranked Arlington Sam Houston. But the season was going to be marked by challenges that seemed to escalate with every game.
All the other teams, you know, they wanted to beat Denton. I think we had the mindset that, you know, hey, this is another game and we're gonna have to step up our game. You know, because it's sort of like to me, they didn't care if they won all district or what, as long as they did beat the Broncos.
Our district opener was against Garland in Garland. They were old rivals, and the Broncos had never beaten the Owls on their home turf.
I got a chip on my shoulder, and everybody had a chip on their shoulder about, for some reason, we had inherited what we were doing well and beat these guys. And to beat Garland was a huge deal.
We did beat Garland that night, 14-8. And if the season had ended then, we would have still been hometown heroes. But the next morning, we found out we were ranked 8th in the state. It wasn't only Denton that was taking notice.
And after that, the newspapers in Dallas started kind of asking, wonder what Billy Ryan has up in Denton.
If we thought our ranking would give us an edge going forward, we were quickly disappointed. The next week, number 8 would meet number 7. North Mesquite had beaten us out of the playoffs the year before. 6 games into this season, they were unbeaten and unscored upon. They had returned 15 starters from the previous year.
Early in the game, Les Varner connected up with Leon Jones for a quick touchdown, and it wasn't just a few plays later that we got the ball back, drove down again, and North Mesquite had not been scored on, as I mentioned, now was behind 14-0. They realized they had a game on their hands. But what was unusual about that football game was Greg Head. Greg made 10 unassisted tackles, 6 in their backfield.
And they went through 3 centers. One of them was the head coach's son.
Yeah. He was honest enough to admit it. But he said, who was that guy that played nose guard for him? He said, that guy was insane, crazy. I mean, he talked to me the whole game, told me what he was going to do to me, and did it.
Before the game was over, head coach called his son over there and said, I'm going to put you back in. Said, I want you to make sure you block him. He turned and looked at his daddy and said, you go out there and block.
He spent half the night in their backfield. But not only him, but Sam Peckham, Tommy Ferris, Madlock, David Bailey, and David Williamson, Jake Irvin all had a wonderful game. They only gave up 14 points when the offense scored 35. To me, that was the best high school football game effort I believe I've ever seen overall. There were no mistakes made.
The North Mesquite game was undoubtedly a turning point in our season. We rose to number 6 in the state after that, the highest ranking a Bronco team had ever achieved, and we rolled over 3 more district opponents in short order. But there was an old foe waiting for us at the end of district play. If anything could take the shine off our season at that point, it would be a loss to the wealthy Dallas suburb, Highland Park, our most despised rival. Denton had beaten them only once in its history, and we weren't going to take our eye off the ball.
CBS came up and wanted to do a story on the Denton Broncos because your success had kind of surprised everybody. And y'all came up and said, I'll never forget it. Y'all said, we've got some business to take care of. We don't want to have any distractions. We'd like for you to go, leave, let us practice, go play Highland Park, and then come back. So we go into Highland Park, Highlander Stadium, storied program, Doak Walker, Bobby Lane.
I remember going out to play Highland Park and having an old gentleman coming up as we were getting to go on the bus say, you've got to beat these guys.
Because we were one of our teams in the district. We had black players. That's why when we got outside of the Highland Park city limits, we had to be escorted in by the police. Mm-hmm. Remember that? Mm-hmm. So escorted in by the police. And then when we got there, that was my first time ever hearing racial slurs.
Whether it was a self-imposed news blackout or Highland Park's special way of reminding us who we were, something had worked for us. Les and Joe racked up over 271 yards of rushing between them, and the defense gave up only 88 yards. Highland Park did not take kindly to the 27-7 beatdown we gave them.
We went down there and beat them, got on the bus. That's where they rocked our bus, egged our bus. Police had to escort us out. When I first went there, when I first saw the escort us, I said, oh man, we get top-notch treatment.
For the first time since 1929, the Broncos had won district outright. And we upped the ante the next game by taking the by-district crown against the Arlington Colts.
So, we're sitting there, by-district champions, and Odessa Permian had defeated Wichita Falls 14-0 in their playoff game. So there we are, we have a meeting with them, and the game was to be played in Abilene, Texas, Shotwell Stadium, 2 p.m. Saturday, December 2nd.
We were about to face the most famous powerhouse in Texas high school football, the Odessa Permian Panthers, equally well known by their nickname, Mojo.
When we played Odessa Permian, I remember vividly the preparation and getting ready for that and the excitement and the pride that we had.
I remember being there, at the field and thinking, there is a lot of people here.
The fans of Denton, we couldn't believe how many showed up for that game. I think we had exactly about the same as many as they did. We estimated, the newspaper said 8,000 to 9,000 came from Denton, and a total crowd of about 15,000 some odd.
It was kind of a tunnel we came in, and I remember the cheerleaders were ahead of the boys, before they came in, and I remember standing there and hearing, yes, yes, and it got louder and louder and louder.
There was a lot of black and white, a lot of mojo going on, but there was just as much purple and gold there, and I was tickled about that. There was a lot of excitement in the air.
It was so fun just being a part of that, and the town and the big stadium and the people going nuts.
We wound up scoring a couple of times in the first half. We were 14 points to their 6. There's 46 seconds left in the half, and they're driving for a score. And they fumbled the ball. Well, Greg Head gets up, recovered the ball, held it up above his head, showed it to the referee. The referee does like this and points it this way, Denton's ball, but the head linesman comes in and says, nope, we blew it dead before he fumbled, so they get another down. So they scored right before the half, mixed the extra point. We go in 14-12.
Key calls had hurt us in the first half, but the heat and the unrelenting power of Odessa were hurting us even more.
Odessa just happened to be bigger, stronger, faster.
And I just always remember the size and shape of half those guys. They seem like they're all 30, but
really. We went in the locker room at halftime. I looked around everybody
this, and man, this is not look good.
And David Barrow, remember they played 3 downs apiece, and didn't matter what it was, they could switch.
Yeah.
And I looked at them and they had this imprint of a headband and this little square red thing from that bill on that head. I said, boy, can you make it? And they said, we'll try.
We went out in the second half with a slight edge, but our advantage would evaporate quickly under the West Texas sun.
The second half, they really dominated. They came out and played well.
And we played them tough for a while, and then it just got where their numbers and their physical power was just more than what we could withstand.
They rolled my ankle. It was just a bad day for everybody.
And they wound up scoring twice more, and this final score was 24-14.
Coming back on the bus, talking to Appleton and a few others, you know, you could tell. I think we started to realize that we'd been real close, you know, and we'd been, and how that's when it first started sinking in. Maybe a little bit of the experience we just been through, because we were real quiet there for the first 100 miles, and I got a little better. But it was a great day. Wish it had ended differently, but it was still a great day.
We had lost to the best team in Texas that year. Some said it was the best team in the nation. It's easy to end a story with a climactic win. Harder to take it somewhere after a tough loss. But I'll try. We were the 6th graduating class after the closing of the Fred Moore School. By the time we reached our senior year, it had been 10 years since the Denton School Board had made their unprecedented decision to desegregate our public schools. Abner Haynes had retired from pro football in 1967, and the women of the Interracial Fellowship were meeting less regularly, though they continued to keep in touch with each other. James McDonald had already left Friends College in Kansas after finishing a 2-year football scholarship, and had taken a job in Wichita, where he would make his home. The year after our graduation, Don Woods would be named NFL Rookie of the Year while breaking the rookie rushing record with the San Diego Chargers. Half a century had passed since the events of Quakertown, and apart from those who had actually lived there or their children, few people knew its story, or would, for another 30 years. Principal Fred Moore had been gone for 20 years, but his daughter, Alice Alexander, had gone on to inspire black and white students in the Denton Public Schools. 40 years later, as I try to connect the dots among these people and events and understand their relationship to my teammates and me, I cannot help but feel that we were in some way a small step in the journey they represent, that of a town struggling to become a community. Though we were neither activists nor pioneers, in the simple act of taking our step together, win or lose, we had made a statement about what was possible. In the end, we were just boys playing football, and the mark those days left on our hearts was just a mysterious gift, for which we are nevertheless grateful.
Why do you do things? Why do you try hard? Why do you try to be the best? And are you afraid, or are you, is there something in you individually that's doing it? But I think we don't understand how, or maybe we can now looking back, how fortunate we were to be stuck in that mix of exceptional people, exceptional coaches, and exceptional players. And we're just lucky.
The pride we feel in those days when we were all Broncos will always be mingled with a sense of how lucky we were. We were born into a world that would have taken it all away, and but for the friendship, courage, and foresight of some remarkable people, it might all have been a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It happened to us in a town called Denton.